Bonjour et bienvenue au laboratoire de cyberjustice. Alors, cher Evgeny Morozov, good afternoon and welcome here at the Cyber Justice Lab for this Legal Information Lexum Chairs Conference. I'm guessing because you are thankfully more and more present in the francophone media sphere that you understand French, so if you allow me, I will continue the short introduction in French. Alors bonjour à tous et à toutes et bienvenue à cette conférence inaugurale 2015 de la chaire Lexum en information juridique. Je profite de cette occasion pour saluer le premier titulaire de la chaire Lexum, le professeur Daniel Poulain. Bonjour Daniel. À première vue, le déballage technologique qui s'opère autour de vous, Evgeny, n'est pas de nature à vous émouvoir. C'est même plutôt le contraire. Vos travaux ont fait de vous le héros de la critique de l'idéologie néolibérale qui se cache derrière les vagues successives d'innovation charriées par la Silicon Valley. Monsieur Morozov, votre voix détonne, car vous prenez très au sérieux le discours de cette nouvelle génération d'hommes trentenaires, blancs, élevés dans les grandes écoles américaines et qui adoptent sans gêne, et je vous cite, la rhétorique communautaire de la contre-culture. Vous ne manquez jamais d'esprit lorsque dans vos livres, dont The Net Delusion and To Save Everything, Click Here, vous chroniquez de manière souvent très drôle l'enthousiasme qui s'empare des foules en pensant à l'idée que les dictateurs de ce monde ne survivront pas à l'expansion d'Internet, que les Uber ou Airbnb de ce monde ne sont animés que par une foi quasi libertarienne de désintermédiation, ou tout simplement que la brosse à dents interactive occupera bientôt une place majeure dans notre salle de bain connectée. Vous nous prenez au mot et nous incitez à adopter une position critique devant les nouveaux abus de langage de notre époque, ces néologismes qui fleurissent ça et là, les e-government, les e-justice, les e-citizen de ce monde, et j'en passe, qui s'invitent désormais, notamment dans les demandes de subventions universitaires, les projets de villes intelligentes, à se demander ce qu'elles étaient avant, et évidemment les plateformes gouvernementales. Alors la force du point de vue que vous défendez, outre son caractère iconoclaste, est donc bienvenue. Dans une enceinte de réflexion comme la nôtre, c'est revenir sur le temps long, c'est resituer les avancées technologiques dans leur contexte historique, bien sûr, comme d'autres le firent, et je pense notamment aux travaux d'Elisabeth Eisenstein avec son livre « The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe ». Mais également, vos travaux nous permettent d'appréhender les problèmes posés par les nouveaux médias à travers un prisme socio-économique. En détournant le regard du caractère socialement construit des infrastructures technologiques qui nous entourent, pour reprendre les mots de Bruno Latour, nous courons le risque de perdre de vue le caractère temporaire et précaire du consensus sur lequel reposent pourtant de tels outils. Compte tenu des nombreuses incidences politiques, sociales, culturelles et économiques qui s'y rattachent, ce consensus devrait normalement rester sujet à révision au terme d'un processus de débat et de délibération, comme vous le prenez vous-même dans votre dernier livre publié en 2013. La question est donc alors de débattre ensemble des contours que devront prendre ces processus et ces technologies. Mais rassurez-vous, vous êtes ici en terre d'accueil. Nous cultivons ici le même doute et nous nous gardons de toute forme de technolatrie ou de technophobie. Je crois personnellement que les technologies qui habillent aujourd'hui cette enceinte judiciaire ne commenceront à aider la justice qu'à partir du moment où les acteurs de ce milieu et les justiciables eux-mêmes auront été placés aux commandes et mis en situation de présider librement à leur destinée technologique. Alors, je vous remercie d'être présent. Je vous invite maintenant à vous adresser.
Malheureusement, je dois le faire en anglais. Okay, so thank you very much for coming, and it's a pleasure for me to be here in Montreal. I do come to Canada quite often, but it's actually my first visit here. I think the 1 hour that I have for my talk, I'm going to spend by reflecting on some of the themes that I've touched upon in my last book, To Save Everything, Click Here, which was, as you've heard, published in 2013, and also reflect on how some of those views have changed in light of some of the developments we are seeing both in North America, in Europe, and globally. This book was written prior to the Snowden revelations. It was written prior to a lot of anxiety that have been raised by the sharing economy. The Uber, when I wrote it, and Airbnb were relatively tiny players, which now have billion-dollar valuations. The question of personal data was not yet as pronounced, so I do have quite a lot to cover. So I'm sure that not everybody here is familiar with my work, where I come from, intellectually, politically, historically, and geographically. So maybe I'll just also say a few words about that, so that all of you are situated more or less in the same milieu. I come from Belarus, as you might have guessed from my name, and originally I was drawn into the subject of technology and new media primarily by thinking through the political implications of digital technologies in the context of post-Soviet space, in which I've grown up. My initial work that led to the publication of my first book, The Net Delusion, was based on actual on-the-ground activist work that I was doing between 2005 to 2008, working for an NGO, mostly financed by various American and European foundations, to try to use various tools of social media and technology to push for democratization, as we would put it back then, in Central Eastern Europe, Central Asia, in the former post-Soviet space. So I spent 3 years, more or less, traveling to places like Central Asia, Moldova, Azerbaijan, but also doing some travel in the Middle East, meeting with activists, bloggers, human rights defenders, politicians in the opposition, and trying to instill in them the spirit and of course, the democratizing spirit, as we thought about it back then, of social media. And at that point, it was mostly blogs and social networks. We were not really yet talking about anything particularly sophisticated. In that period, in the 3 years that I've spent on the ground, my own views have changed quite radically. I started more or less as a utopian, as a person who thought that if only we put enough of those technologies on the ground in places like Belarus, where I come from, but also many of the places in Central Asia, we would actually see very robust mobilization of activists, NGOs, various political forces. People will suddenly get access to information. They'll be able to know the truth about various human rights abuses by their governments, and so forth. Of course, much of it, as I discovered later, was very naive. The work that we were doing was relatively marginal. It didn't really have much of an impact on the ground. The problem was much more different, and it was that a lot of the governments in the countries where we were working were becoming increasingly sophisticated about the uses of those technologies. They were actually running their own little think tanks, technology shops, in order to create new tools for propaganda, to train bloggers to go online and spread their own ideology, to train people who can go online and launch denial of service attacks on the websites of independent publishers. There was a lot of expertise, not to mention surveillance, of course, inside these governments themselves, and it seemed to me that we were actually fighting a very unequal fight. Later, of course, it also occurred to me that the reason why there was so much expertise inside authoritarian, as we called them back then, governments, was that there were a lot of Western firms that were very eager to supply them with various tools and technologies to engage in surveillance, to engage in propaganda, to engage in all of the relatively evil activities that they were undertaking, right? All of that was completely unregulated, and while a lot of Western politicians, including Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, would go and talk about the importance of internet freedom, and we would hear all those wonderful talks and speeches about how America considers the internet to be the greatest tool of democracy, there were quite a few American but also Western European firms more than eager to supply these regimes with such technologies. So that got me thinking about a lot of things, about the hypocrisy of Western politicians on this front, about the connections between the various business models that these companies were undertaking and the authoritarian regimes that were benefiting from those companies. Ultimately, that led, as I've said, to the publication of the first book. But what I also noticed while working on that project was that increasingly inside the State Department, which is a place I got to know and studied while working on that book, there was this growing reliance on Silicon Valley as a provider of solutions, as a provider of various handy tools that somehow can be adapted by policymakers in the State Department to claim that they are advancing with their agenda, whether it's promotion of democracy, of freedom of expression, and so forth. Thus, there was a lot of expectation that the spread of Twitter, Facebook, Google throughout the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia, you name it, would eventually lead to democratization. So the operating theory that a lot of policymakers inside American government had at the time was that it's actually the best of all possible worlds. We can actually see American high-tech capitalism go and conquer the world, while at the same time see authoritarian regimes crumble and people rising in the streets waving mobile phones and pushing for regime change. And a lot of anecdotal evidence, which was of course disproportionately blown out and out of proportion by the Western media, like the 2009 Green protests in Iran, 2011 Arab Spring protests across the Middle East, and a few other cases. Some of you might remember the Moldova revolution, Twitter revolution slightly before Iran, created this impression that it was really the case that the spread of these tools, platforms, and technologies was eventually leading to greater democratization. Right? Of course, if you think about it retroactively, and that was obvious to quite a few people at the time, that was a very utopian presentation of reality that completely disregarded, of course, the tremendous amount of surveillance of the internet and various digital platforms that America itself was engaged in, but also disregarded all the other uses of these platforms and technologies by the US military, by the NSA, by the CIA for the very purposes that they were condemning authoritarian regimes for pursuing. I'm not just talking about surveillance, I'm also talking about things like cyber attacks, which quite a lot of various units within the US governments were actually engaged in launching cyber attacks on the websites of jihadis, but also of the regimes that they didn't like. So reflecting on that experience of how Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, Twitter became this favorite businesses and became the favorite children, if you will, and the favorite preferred symbols of this new high-tech capitalism for the State Department made me start thinking and reflecting on the ways in which Silicon Valley and many of the companies associated with it were also positioning themselves as essential to not just promoting democracy globally, a narrative that I found very false, but also to solving a lot of other problems. Whether those problems had to do with fighting climate change through more efficient energy monitoring technologies, or whether it has to do with fighting things like obesity by helping us monitor how much we exercise, how much we consume, how much we sleep, what we eat, whether it has to do with education through the proliferation of various Silicon Valley funded and created massive open online courses, whether it has to do with crime prevention and crime prediction, which revolves around analysis of data. Suddenly I saw Silicon Valley, and I'm talking about Silicon Valley in much the same manner that a lot of people talk about Wall Street. For me, it's just a collective term for a bunch of companies that we can, of course, discuss in their own terms, but I still think it's very important to stick to some homogeneity across them. So Silicon Valley was emerging as some kind of a default provider of solutions to quite a lot of problems that were facing governments, right? And that made me think about what were the causes of this sudden turn towards Silicon Valley inside governments. And by governments, I don't just mean national governments, I also mean city administrations, regional institutions, and so forth. But also, what would the implications be as we delegate more and more responsibility for problem solving to the likes of Google, Facebook, Apple, and so on, right? And that more or less what prompted me to write my second book, To Save Everything, Click Here, which was a critique of this kind of attitude inside Silicon Valley that they can just sort of parachute themselves into an issue, come up with a nice business model, mostly revolving around data collection, data analysis, and then perhaps selling or advertising, and suddenly they can resolve an issue at hand. Right? And I try to understand what were some of the political implications of relying on this mode of problem solving with citizens taking on much of the responsibility for many of these problems. Just to give you a very specific example, if you think about a problem like health, specifically about obesity, the pitch that you hear from Silicon Valley, it's very simple. And namely, it's that, well, let us monitor everything that you do. Let us monitor, as I've said, your consumption of food, your activity level, your sleeping patterns, and so forth. And we would be able to insert ourselves, because we run not just the monitoring system that detects virtually everything you do, but we also control the screens that you look at. So there is a way for us to nudge you all the time and tell you, well, you have to be doing this, you have to be doing this, you have to be walking more, you have to be eating less. All of that allows, more or less, this very nice regime of individual intervention where a problem like obesity suddenly gets redefined on terms that are very individualistic and no longer social and critical in character. So suddenly a lot of problems get redefined on terms that basically do not really acknowledge the existence of actors, structures, and institutions that go beyond just the individual, who becomes the locus of taking on responsibility for whatever issue he or she is facing in their life. Right, so for me, clearly there was, those of you familiar with some of the recent critical political critiques, it was obvious to me that there is something there that resembles a lot of the debates that are happening in this sort of studies of neoliberalism, that there is some kind of similarity between this and what in that literature is called responsibilization, namely that individuals are constantly encouraged and asked to take on and internalize the logic by which they are the ones creating their own problems, so they are the ones who have to be responsible for solving them. Right? And as I started thinking about it, it became obvious to me that more or less this is the episteme, if you will, according to which Silicon Valley operates. They gather data mostly about one particular level of social actors, those actors being individual users, and they change the world, if you will, by also manipulating just one layer, and it's us users, namely the citizens. So if we do decide to tackle a problem like obesity or climate change or crime prevention or you name it, by focusing just on individual actors, it means that we just let a lot of other social and political forces off the hook. So we no longer actually investigate any and produce any kind of causal models as to why problems exist, why problems happen, what were some of the social, political, historical grievances that might have led to a particular problem. We just focus on the low-hanging fruit, which at this point is tinkering with the individual citizen and getting that individual citizen to behave in a way that will minimize the damage and the effect caused by that problem, right? And I think health is not, and obesity specifically, is not a bad example to stick to, because I'm sure I don't have to say it in this room. We all know that through the 70s and 80s, we did have exposure to a lot of very radical critiques of the critical studies, social studies of health, for example, which did try to present a lot of health problems as essentially being the products of various political, economic, and social forces, and not just the failure of individual citizen or patient to control their eating habits or exercise more. Right? I mean, all of the behaviors that Silicon Valley tries to define as just individual failings on our behalf can also probably be situated in a much larger narrative, linking it to the power of lobbyists to set the rules as to what kind of food is served in cafeteria, to what kind of ads you see on television, advertising junk food, to how easy it is to actually reach a lot of the organic markets with organic food. If you don't happen to have a car, which would probably be the case for a lot of people in sort of low-income bracket, at least in America. All of those causal explanations by which problems could have actually been explained and defined prior suddenly kind of disappear from the table, and we are just focusing on, as I've said, on the low-hanging fruit of just manipulating the easiest actor, which at this point is entirely transparent, because everything about what we do as individuals is there for recording, taking, analysis, and manipulation. So if you think of individuals existing on the same kind of ontological plane as lobbyists, corporations, think tanks, and other social actors, the most transparent actor in that entire chain, of course, is the individuals, because we are relying on services that, because of their business model, and that business model being advertising, are built in a way that they can always be monitored and peered into. And peered into, I don't mean it in a technical sense, but actually you can look inside our communication. We do not have the same mechanisms for controlling what corporations or think tanks or many of the other institutions that exist on the same social plane actually do. And if you think about it, there is some kind of asymmetry, an epistemic asymmetry, if you will, happening, whereby we actually know more and more about individuals, as the NSA revelations show us, and we know less and less about what governments, think tanks, and corporations are doing, because they are actually actively trying to conceal their activities by, depending on which country you look at, by privatizing more and more of services and agencies that were previously public and are subject to freedom of information laws, to corporations manipulating science by producing a lot of studies that actually have nothing to do with reality. So there is more and more obfuscation happening at other levels of the social field, while the individuals are there, easy to observe, easy to manipulate, easy to govern. Right? And that kind of rather green picture of the world more or less informed how I approach Silicon Valley in my second book. And there was another, of course, level of critique that I tried to advance in that book, and it was about the ways in which Silicon Valley just fails to understand something about human condition, right? And this is where I launched into some kind of a broadly philosophical critique about the values and virtues of ambiguity and friction, and the way in which it's actually nice to have various gaps and friction in how we live and how we operate and how we communicate. And Silicon Valley just misunderstands that. So the way to resolve that is to probably have a public debate and convince them that friction is very important. I must say that I have completely failed in that endeavor, and I don't think that that type of critique actually has much appeal going for it, for the sole reason that even if you manage to convince the public that yes, there is this element of edginess and disorganization and ambiguity and ambivalence that makes humans different from robots or machines, it still doesn't really get you very far, because currently in most countries that I look at, there is just no alternative political project to Silicon Valley. And I say political for a very particular reason, because at this point, there is no other way to oppose what these companies are doing with regards to many of their activities. There is no way in which a country, even if it decides to protect some of those values that I try to highlight and promote in the book, even if they want to do that, it's going to prove extremely challenging to even try to challenge it in very basic terms, right? And I would like to spend actually quite a bit of time reflecting on these matters, because, I had this misleading, I think, belief that somehow Europe could provide some kind of an alternative to what was happening in America. And that belief stayed with me for quite a long time, even since I published the second book. And what I discovered is that even in Europe right now, there is actually no political will to challenge the model that is slowly emerging in California, right? And I just want to unpack this a little bit. So the model as it emerges in California, as I see it, says something as follows. We basically continue with privatization of as many industries and as many sectors as we can. Ideally, we have big technology companies moving in to run those sectors, and those sectors can be transportation, health, education, you name it. I mean, anything that at this point involves data, and virtually, many sectors of the economy actually do involve data, if you think about it. They will be run by some kind of combination of Google, IBM, Microsoft, Cisco, HP, Facebook, Apple. Right? That's the sort of the new set of players that we're missing from the picture before, where we had, 20 years ago, we would think it would be GE or GM or Walmart or whatever. Now it's those companies, and maybe I forgot Amazon. And the idea is that they will come and they will run it for you. So as a city, as a country, as a region, all you have to do is to basically let them in. They'll come and they will organize services for you, whether it's caring for the aged and the elderly. They will do it simply by installing sensors into homes, bus stops, cities, generating the data, monitoring what's happening with the elderly, analyzing their sleeping patterns, analyzing when they fall, and then, having them to do exercise at the right moment. I'm not actually joking. Singapore just launched a robot that teaches the elderly how to be fit, that they're putting in virtually all senior homes for the senior people in Singapore. But it can also be at other levels. Energy, how would we optimize its consumption? We will optimize it, of course, with smart thermostats that we would get from Google, or with smart lights that we'll get from Philips, or from some other smart technology that will come part of the smart city package that we'll probably buy in bulk from Cisco, HP, or IBM. Right? So the promise that Silicon Valley makes, it's actually, I think it's very interesting, and it has to be understood, because underlying that promise is also the fact that a lot of these services will nominally be offered for free to a lot of citizens. So if you think about many of these sort of health apps that I've mentioned, and if you think about even some of the basic apps that have to do with other things, energy, and so forth, a lot of them actually come free, right? You don't pay for them at all, which to some extent, to me, signifies that Silicon Valley does emerge as a substitute of sorts to the old institutions of the welfare state that were supposed to provide some of the services, which also explains why a lot of governments in Europe and elsewhere actually feel quite enthusiastic about having some of these companies to do that job for them. Because once Silicon Valley comes in, and they can more or less run predictive healthcare, and they can run a lot of other things in a predictive manner, I mean, they do provide a rather interesting alternative to the institutions which can no longer basically afford to cater for the elderly, for the sick, for the obese, and so forth, right? And it's in those terms that we have to understand what's happening right now. Because ultimately, the promise of Silicon Valley is very different from the kind of nightmare that we thought 15, 10, 20 years ago that neoliberalism would give us. Back then, the thought was that as everything gets privatized and technology companies and financial companies move in, we will end up paying for everything. We'll end up paying for healthcare. We'll end up paying for, content. We will end up paying for education and so forth. The model that is emerging now, with data as some kind of a currency that is underwriting the provision of a lot of these services, is very different. A lot of the services are actually either very cheap or they come for free because they are monetized elsewhere. And they're monetized essentially through data, which is then being collected and then sold somewhere on advertising markets. And for me, this is a very interesting challenge in that traditional critics of the left, traditional critics of this kind of neoliberal model do not know how to tackle a model which promises so many things for free. which allows Silicon Valley and a lot of these companies to basically occupy the discursive space that was previously occupied by all sorts of leftist groups, movements, and causes. Because ultimately, it's very easy for somebody like Eric Schmidt or Larry Page or anybody from that crowd to stand up and say, well, we are the ones who are caring for the poor people because we are actually the ones who are offering them services for free, right? Which actually should not be underestimated. They do get a lot of street cred, so to say, in Silicon Valley, even inside the sort of physical space, precisely for that they do function as some sort of vehicle of social mobility and social advancement, precisely because so many of the platforms and services are provided for free, of course, on a model that's very different politically and economically from the model that we would traditionally associate with the welfare state, right? And this example that I made before about obesity, I think is a very good example. Normally, perhaps, under normal sort of conditions that are about to disappear in much of the Western world as the welfare state crumbles and collapses, the idea was that you did not really have to subject yourself to 24/7 monitoring of all of your health data and thus feel anxious on a 24/7 basis because you knew that there was always a doctor available for you who will see you and treat you if a problem emerges and you would be able to get treatment anytime you need. The model as it emerges now is very different, and it basically focuses on making you anxious and making you actually want to be in charge because you do not actually know if you would be able to get the health care that you want, right? So it's a very different type of welfare, but I think it's still useful to think about it through that perspective nonetheless. And coming back to the sort of broader narrative that I was trying to lay down before, I think the pitch that is coming from Silicon Valley, but also from the US government to the rest of the world is that once you let American companies in, and with the new trade treaties that we are negotiating, and in your case, that have been negotiated, it would then be very hard to get them out. There will be all sorts of benefits that accrue to the countries on the receiving end because these companies will move in and reorganize entire system of production, social organization, production of health, education, and so forth in a manner that's just super efficient, super effective, super lean, right? Which explains how cities which should have known better, I'm thinking about a city like Barcelona, for example, could become a hotbed of the most crazy technology of the smart city variety suddenly entering the city in the last 10 years, concurrent with privatization of virtually everything, and becoming the sort of the symbol of all that these companies could deliver, promise, or at least showcase in the case, in the space of a single city. Right? And in the case of a city like Barcelona, what we're also seeing now is that as the new mayor moves in, I don't know how much you know about the political context in Europe, but in Spain, there is a new political party, Podemos, which is trying to challenge the political establishment, and they have managed to win two big cities, Barcelona and Madrid. And what we are now seeing in Barcelona is that, yes, they have a very new radical mayor who has stepped in and says, well, we don't actually want Cisco, HP, and Microsoft running all of our city in a way that we cannot examine, control, judge, or do anything about it because A, much of it is proprietary software, and B, all of these contracts are signed for almost eternity, so there is no way to actually challenge them. So you have this new mayor moving in and saying that we want to rethink and reconsider our stance, and what the mayor is discovering is that there is just simply no alternative project to turn to. Because you do not have an open source alternative to the smart city. You do not have anything of the kind that a city can roll out, not to be dependent on the tools that are being pitched to it by the likes of Cisco, HP, Microsoft, and others, right? And to me, it's a very big problem for the sole reason that whatever political force, if it does emerge in a single country, would want to challenge this new system of highly cybernetic, feedback-driven, welfare system that Silicon Valley promises us under the label of innovation, entrepreneurship, disruption, and whatnot, it will be extremely hard to do that without actually mounting not just a technological challenge by building the same system capable of analyzing all the data, collecting it, and so forth, but also building an alternative legal regime that will actually try to think of data as something that will not automatically be treated as a commodity that can be bought and sold and that has a financial value attached to it, right? Because ultimately, when I look at a company like Google, right, and the big debate that currently is brewing in Europe and elsewhere, and perhaps also in America, it is precisely about the status of data, right? And it's precisely about the way in which companies like Google have a right to claim the data that we generate as their own or not, and if not, how can we, the citizens, can have some access to it, and then how can we make it available for all sorts of collective, community-driven, city-based efforts so that alternative projects to Uber or Airbnb can emerge. Because ultimately, if we have no way to pull our data together, we will not be able to organize a public transportation system that will be superior to what Uber or any other company of its type is providing or is promising. And it might not be easy to grasp what I have in mind here, but I'm thinking specifically about one project in Europe, in Helsinki, in Finland. There is a very interesting project whereby the city of Helsinki partnered with a local university to roll out a system which basically allows citizens in the city to use an app and say, well, I'm in this particular part of town and I want to go to that particular type of town. And in the meantime, in the cloud, there is this algorithm that calculates how you actually want to arrange the distribution and transportation of these people, and the minivan goes and picks up 6 or 7 of them in real time and drops them off where they need to go, right? And as such, you get the benefits, the flexibility benefits of something like Uber, but you don't get a lot of the baggage that comes with it. In that you don't necessarily need the system where drivers rank passengers and passengers rank drivers. You can actually have drivers who are, employed in normal jobs that are well protected, and you also actually get a reasonably affordable system where people just pay a very small amount of money to enjoy all the benefits of personalization and decentralization. The problem is that for such systems to scale, we would need to find ways in which we can also start sharing and exchanging and perhaps pooling some of the data that we ourselves are generating as we navigate the city and as we interact with each other in the social realm, right? And my fear is that unless there is a real and substantial political challenge, a lot of that data will remain in either the silos sort of belonging to big technology companies, or alternatively, there will be a market created in it, and we will all be trading in the data that we ourselves are generating, which is the only alternative that is more or less visible on the table right now, with a lot of startups, ironically also coming from Silicon Valley, basically offering to help you set up a little personal locker somewhere online, and they will pay you money if advertisers or any other people come and access that data. So it's a way to basically get some of that data away from Google, Facebook, but also from the big data brokers that are selling the data on secondary markets, and give the data to citizens and let them become entrepreneurs of some sort, right? And I'm not convinced that those are the only two options that are worth considering, right? And thinking of an option in which data in itself is not something to be traded, but nonetheless can be donated or exchanged or pulled together in a nationwide or citywide structure and pool, I think would be a very useful beginning. But even that, assuming that that happens, would still leave a lot of problems with regards to the rest of the infrastructure, because ultimately I think it's not just the data, it's also the ability to make use of it, which means that at this point it will be the likes of IBM with the Watson system and Google with its immense computing infrastructure that can actually benefit from the data that's being generated. So just making it available for public use is not going to benefit everybody equally, because the parties that are likely to benefit from it will be more or less the same very corporations from which we're trying to take the data away, right? So figuring out a way in which you can democratize that would be a very big necessary step, but also figuring out how you can democratize other parts of the stack, so to say, right? You have to start thinking about ways in which data that has already been accumulated by a company like Google ultimately does serve as a great barrier to entry for other companies, startups, initiatives, even that could be run by libraries or cities that want to do something around data, especially in the field of search. I actually believe that the rhetoric that a lot of people defending Google are advancing, that namely you can just invent a better algorithm and that algorithm might one day disrupt Google, it just completely misrepresents how search today actually works. Google derives much of its ability to generate useful results not from the algorithm, but from the data that has already accumulated about you, where you have been, what you have searched for in the past, where you are right now, and what's happening in all of the other platforms from Google that you're using. So it looks at your email, it looks at your use of YouTube, Google Scholar, Google Docs, and other platforms in order to generate a prediction as to what you might be searching next, in the next hour, in the next month, in the next day, and so forth. And you can see that logic informing a service like Google Now, which actually is Google's attempt at producing what they call autonomous search, which is basically search that is conducted on your phone or any of the Google systems that you're using in the background without you even asking Google to conduct a search query. So the fact that Google knows that I'm now in Montreal and I'm in a particular cafe near a particular museum probably triggers normally a certain search query, and I don't even have to place it because Google already shows me the answer on the Google Now system, right? And if you think about it, that means that much of the traditional search that we're engaging in now in Google with ads will become obsolete sooner or later. But it also means that unless a competitor has access to the same data that Google has accumulated over the last 10 years, there is no way that you can match the quality of predictions that Google is making with just generating a better algorithm, right? Which to me suggests that we are basically in a situation where it's extremely hard, if not to say impossible, to challenge the power of many of these firms for the sole reason that there are so many synergies between the systems that they're currently running, with data from smart thermostat and email being integrated together to generate one informational profile of you that can then generate predictions about what you might be doing next and thus serve you the data you might be needing at the moment. Which to me suggests that the only way in which an actor or a block of actors can challenge that hegemony, to use a fancy word, is by operating on a scale that goes far beyond that of a local community or cooperative or even the city or even the nation state. It will be extremely impossible to create what needs to be created to challenge the dominance of Silicon Valley and the broader political program that stands behind it. And I'm sorry, I can't go more into the specificity of the political program, but believe me, it's there. It's impossible to do it unless a lot of resources and a lot of money is being pulled together and challenges are mounted not just at the level of, we'll build a fancy app, But challenges are mounted at the level of the operating system for mobile phones. They are challenged at the level of search engines. They're challenged at the level of data regime. They are challenged basically at the level of virtually every single layer that they are controlling. That's the only way in which any reasonable opposition can be mounted. And at this point, Europe, which is a regional bloc that is capable of mounting this opposition, is not in a position to do anything, in part because the anti-Silicon Valley agenda in Europe is completely seized by existing incumbent European corporations. They basically are afraid that Google will come and disrupt them. So we're talking about German car manufacturers and banks and media companies with a couple of French ones being the leading drivers of this Google and Silicon Valley bashing in Europe. And they are not at all interested in somehow resisting the political agenda behind Silicon Valley or creating an alternative to it that might favor more communal uses of data so that you can create some kind of better public transportation system. They couldn't care less. They just want to defend their position as leading providers of banking services, cars, and media services supported by advertising in a particular market. That's it. There is very little by means of popular citizen input in opposing this agenda in Europe. So I think Europe is off the table. What's left are basically two opportunities. You have some interesting moves happening at the level of BRICS, with Brazil slowly dropping off from that BRIC bloc, with basically Russia, China, and India trying to do at least something to resist complete dominance of Silicon Valley. And Russia and China were the two countries that kind of started thinking about these issues much earlier for reasons that had very little to do with economics and had everything to do with politics. Because and I understood it when I was writing my first book, because as the State Department in America kept beating this drum that Twitter and Facebook are the tools of revolutionaries, these governments understood that, yes, if they're tools of revolutionaries, these revolutions will be kind of American revolutions, so we will get, in the case of Russia, another Ukraine happening somewhere, and we don't want that to happen, so all we have to do is just to create local alternatives to American systems. So they did create they had it before, but they really boosted it, a Russian alternative to Google in terms of search, alternative to Facebook, alternative to email system, so there is at least some effort to maintain and create and develop some kind of technological sovereignty that extends over 5 or 6 years. What has been happening in the last 2 years in Russia is actually a bit more interesting because partly as the result of the sanctions that we imposed because of the war in Ukraine, Russians have been thinking across a much broader set of issues about how they can actually minimize their dependence on foreign and mostly Western European and American players. So they have been thinking really hard about it, not just about technology, but also about food imports and other things. When it comes to technology, they actually understood that they don't want to end up in a situation where somebody can just cut off the internet connection or somebody can actually manipulate how their cities operate by tinkering with the software, who can tinker with their mobile phones, right? So they went and bought whatever was left of Nokia's operating system. And now they're pouring grant money to encourage developers to write applications for it in order to challenge Android and iOS, and trying to get interest from the Chinese, Brazilians, Indians, and others to step in and try to boost it at least as a state level or regional level alternative to Silicon Valley. It's not, in some sense, it's an interesting approach. It comes very late. But it's the kind of things that should have been done a long time ago and weren't done, and they should have involved not Russia and China and Iran, but they should have involved Western Europe and maybe Canada and others. The reason, of course, why it's not happening, and I'll come to another regional bloc that I want to discuss a bit later, the reason why it's not happening is because I just don't see, for example, in Europe, any political will to minimize their dependence on America. And that also explains TTIP, trade treaties, and everything else. And as long as that political will is missing, I just don't find it particularly surprising that Europe has no wish or desire whatsoever for technological sovereignty as such. So, of course, there are all sorts of local initiatives. You go to France, it seems to me that they have, a new institute for technological sovereignty set up almost every week. The problem is that if you look at them closely, it's a bunch of French companies which are trying to free ride on the publicity generated by the Snowden scandal and offer secure French cloud services, or offer secure something that also bears the mark of a French company, but it does not really challenge the underlying logic that the services will be run in a private manner, data will be a commodity, smart cities have to be run by corporations, and so forth. It's all of that just wearing a different nationalistic flag outside, which to me politically just doesn't sound particularly exciting. So that aside, the only other regional bloc that's currently trying to do anything to at least challenge whatever is coming out of Silicon Valley are some of the countries in Latin America, and I'm thinking specifically about Ecuador, Argentina, Bolivia, and Venezuela before it got into a big mess. And what's happening there is that they are actually trying to create a regional science and technology policy where they could start investing money on a very serious level. It's going to be more money than any nation state can afford to actually start creating robust independent infrastructure through which they can perhaps lessen their dependence on Silicon Valley, right? And I think that for them, it's an issue that is much easier to grasp because they are the ones who are trying still to deal with the mess that was left by the activities of many American companies in Latin America over the course of the last 40 years. So for them, it's very easy to grasp what it is that Facebook will be doing in Latin America as it proceeds with its Facebook.org initiative, right? I don't know how many of you know about Facebook.org, but to me, this is probably a very nice example of this kind of Silicon Valley welfare state that I was describing earlier. So what Internet.org does, and Internet.org, it's a domain name, but it's also an entity that was set up by Facebook in cooperation with various telecom operators. And what they offer you basically is to go to a developing country, they mostly work in developing countries, in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and basically they promise to get you online for free, right? And it sounds very nice. Who wouldn't want to be online for free? But once you read the fine print, of course, what you get for free is access to Facebook. And what you don't get for free is everything else. So you have to pay for it by megabyte. You're basically paying by traffic for accessing the rest of the internet, which creates all sorts of distortions into how people consume content, produce content, and so forth, because suddenly it means that, if you want to reach, if you're a university and if you want to reach students in a country where most people get online through Internet.org, you are better off putting your content on Facebook because that way people who access it wouldn't need to pay. Right? It's a very simple equation, which means that suddenly an activity like education, which previously would not involve Facebook as an intermediary, suddenly does involve Facebook as an intermediary, and Facebook starts collecting data about people who are pursuing, study of physics or whatever through its platform. Right? And that's just one of the many things that are disturbing about Internet.org, but to me this is precisely the kind of a mechanism whereby you do get some marginal benefits, and Facebook's claim is that it's better for us to give this limited internet to the poor, to leave them with none, and for governments who have more or less abandoned any effort to promote some kind of inclusion that would not happen on the terms set by telecommunication firms and Silicon Valley, that sounds like a nice gig. So, you end up with pictures, and, I can probably even find that photo for you now, of the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, wearing a Facebook hoodie, standing right next to Mark Zuckerberg, promoting Internet.org as a nice contribution to digital inclusion, right? But the digital inclusion that it promotes is as inclusive as financial inclusion that is promoted by loan sharks and banks, right? I mean, everybody would like to get you hooked, in a sense, right? And then all sorts of things started happening which you did not anticipate in the beginning, right? So there are governments, there are not many, who are hypersensitive to these issues, in part because they have seen those dependencies created in their countries over a much broader and longer period of time. So they understand what Silicon Valley, represents, and it represents far more than just, giving you access to chats and sharing photos. I mean, it represents a way to completely transform the delivery of a lot of services, public services especially, that this countries either didn't have or provided in a very disorganized, chaotic manner. So the efficiency that these companies promise, it's not fake efficiency, it's a real one. But the problem even with Latin America is that there is just not enough talent to build this stuff, even if there is money on the table. So I am in a somewhat depressive mood, I must say, because I just don't see the alternative at this point, and I don't see the political blocks that will emerge to challenge the agenda that I think in the next 5 or 10 years will advance far beyond the backyard of Western Europe and North America. Because this is where all of these companies are heading. They are heading for the emerging markets, and they want to do basically what the World Bank failed to do 10 or 20 years ago. With establishment of welfare and services that work on a very neoliberal model where you can forget about things like solidarity. They will not even be mentioned in any of the documents. I mean, all that will be mentioned is entrepreneurship, the need for people to be able to build their own app, to resolve their own problem on their own and make some money in the process. I mean, there is also this degree of everyday neoliberalism, if you want to call it, that is embedded in the use of many of those tools. And it makes it very hard for people and communities to think in terms that oppose that logic, right? And in this sense, we're also missing the analysis that can actually situate Silicon Valley within a much broader and longer process that does not just begin with Mark Zuckerberg and Eric Schmidt or Larry Page, but that can stretch over a much longer period of time and to show the consistency of the efforts to basically advance economic development, welfare, foreign policy, and in this case, that's the foreign policy of America, with the help of these corporate players, right? And I do not see how else we can actually start challenging it if not through this analysis. And instead what we get in most of the debates we have about technology, law, politics, and global affairs is some kind of variation on the concerns raised by Edward Snowden, which mostly have to do with legality, and I'm in the right venue to be saying this, but they do not in any way question the underlying rationale according to which Silicon Valley operates. So every time I follow these debates that have been raised by Edward Snowden, my feeling is that he would actually be content if only all of the legal issues were ironed out and big American companies would push for better encryption standards and NSA will have proper legal supervision, and then suddenly all the problems will go away. So you can actually solve that problem by some kind of a combination of legal and technological interventions. And I don't think that we are even close to resolving any of the issues that I've highlighted today by that combination of interventions. In part because here we really have to start questioning not just the fact that these companies run on data and there is surveillance happening and there is all sorts of nasty things happening in the background, but it's impossible not to link the commercial and financial interests of the sector in Silicon Valley to the broader foreign policy interests of the United States, not to mention the national security interests of the NSA. I mean, to me, it's obvious that a fully decentralized even if you stick fully to the neoliberal playbook, at least in the European sense, and you would actually be critical of monopolies, you would say, fine, let's have a fully decentralized marketplace in the United States where everybody competes with everybody, and we have 10, 15 providers of search, email, and everything else. I mean, clearly, that would make the life of NSA much harder for the sole reason that they would not have a centralized provider like Google, which organizes data from everything from smart thermostat to smart cars to emails to search engines to smartphones to everything else, and presents it to you on a plate, whether you have a warrant or not. Right? And this is where it is impossible to wrap your hand around these issues without understanding how this question of monopolies operating at such a big scale in the US actually benefits the national security state. Right? And that also is a question that I feel has barely been touched, at least in the debates that have happened since Snowden in the last few years. And this is why I think it's extremely important to look at how, well, I mean, in Canada, you have already looked at it with the TPP being concluded recently. In Europe, there is still hope that, you know, perhaps there might be some opposition to TTIP, the trade treaty. But even there, if you look at the lobbying, and if you look at the rhetoric, and if you look at the ideological climate that has surrounded these issues in Europe, you can clearly see who calls all the shots. I mean, the debate about the free flow of data that is one of the key, sort of ideological objectives of TTIP in Europe is advanced by a handful of think tanks with close ties to the European Commission and as close ties to the Silicon Valley. So ultimately, the entire debate around these issues in Europe, inside the Commission and national governments, operates solely along the line of the economic dimension. To what extent it will boost economic growth or not, to what extent this is efficient, to what extent this is not efficient. The basic values of, to what extent you actually want to be thinking about values like privacy through the lens of what it does to the free flow of data, they don't even enter the conversation. Because clearly, something like privacy, yes, it is a very big barrier to the free flow of data, and maybe it's a good thing. But if you approach this issue solely from the perspective of economic growth, which I'm afraid in Europe at this point is the only way to go about it, you will not even notice that. And I'm afraid that the public opinion on this matters in Europe doesn't really register many of these issues. I don't know how these things have played out in Canada, but what I'm noticing is that even at the level of just producing digital ideologies, different ideologies that are different to Silicon Valley, there is just a giant vacuum in Europe, and as far as I can tell, surely in North America. These stories and narratives are just not there, and the think tanks that can be producing different reports are not there, and there is an entire intellectual vacuum that exists, and I just don't know who will fill it. So at this point, I would say I am much more depressed and pessimistic about how things are and will be than I was when I wrote my book and published my book 2 years ago. And I don't really have an uplifting message. We can be as convinced that Silicon Valley is full of very arrogant people who ultimately misunderstand the human condition and don't understand the value of conflict and friction and so forth. But unfortunately, understanding that gets us very little in terms of opposing that agenda. And the political project that can exist to oppose it exists either in places with their own somewhat dubious track record in human rights, be that Russia or China, or it exists in places like Latin America where there are just so many other issues that are currently occupying their attention, including the possibility of coups, revolutions, and all sorts of other destabilizations, that they just don't have the time and the attention to focus on it. And in the meantime, and I'll stop and conclude here, in the meantime, even in places like India, which you would expect to be somehow, trying to articulate an alternative paradigm together with Russia and China, you see this completely outlandish announcements, as the one we have seen last year of President Modi promising to build 100 smart cities in a few years with the help of, completely from scratch, with the help of giant American and German and other companies. And this is what's happening in countries that might be challenging some of this agenda, at least marginally. So the situation is quite bad, and I hope you will disagree with me in the Q&A session. Thank you. And I must say that I flew in from Berlin this morning, so my flight landed 4 hours ago, so I'm not at my sharpest, but I'll do my best.